I've got a lot to talk about today, so I want to jump right into it. But to give you a little context for this work that ended up turning into the book Resilient Agriculture, I was working with a team to do a report that was input to the third National Climate Assessment, and my work on that team was to guide the development of the Adaptation Chapter. This was back in 2011, 2012, and I was shocked to learn that we could find no peer-reviewed research exploring what American farmers were experiencing in the field related to changing weather patterns and more variable weather. So I decided at that time that once I was done with that report, I would begin working on a project to bring American farmers' voices into climate change discussions in this country. That was the beginning of this work. I really thought it was important that we hear from people that I believe are in the front lines of learning to manage the increased variability and extremes of weather that we are experiencing all over the country. So today I want to talk a little bit about climate risk, a little bit about resilience, some solutions in sustainable agriculture that I believe all agriculture can take advantage of. Some of the adaptation stories I found in my work interviewing farmers all across the country, and then sort of a summary of what I see the key resilience practices of these producers, and then a little bit about where you can find out more. So let's kick on. So what is climate risk? In climate change literature, adaptation literature, climate risk is being viewed as this new emerging factor that is being driven by the increased variability and extremes that we're seeing in weather patterns and changing weather patterns. In agriculture, climate or weather used to be, or typically is included in production risk. You're seeing a pretty standard example of the different kinds of risks that farmers manage every day. But what's different, what's new, and what climate change is bringing into the mix of managing farms and ranches is more variability, increasing extremes, to the point that it's being viewed as a new or novel kind of risk. So it's coming out of production and becoming its own risk to be addressed with management practices. So you can think about climate risk as having three components. And I think it's helpful to break this risk down because it helps you look at what a farmer can manage and what they really can't manage. So it really focuses management emphasis on the areas of climate risk or the parts of climate risk that can be managed on the farm. And the first part is exposure, and that's the degree to which the farm experiences climate-related risks. And I'm going to show you some data in just a little bit to explain this in more detail, but climate change is changing weather patterns in different ways across the country. And so a particular farm in a particular place is not going to experience the full range of possible climate change effects. There'll be some that are more important in that location or that region and others that really aren't even being experienced. And I'll show you some data about that. So if you want to begin to think about managing climate risk, the first step in that would be to look at what exposures are being experienced in the region and then in the specific location. The second part of climate risk is sensitivity, and that's the degree to which the farm or the farm system is affected by climate-related events. This is another area where the farm system, the decisions being made about what kind of crops to grow or livestock to produce and how to produce them, the producer can begin to start thinking about their sensitivity and possibly changing up crops. For example, in some areas of the country, more variable spring weather is really beginning to complicate fruit tree production because the more variable spring weather is creating greater risk of frost damage in the spring. So a producer might decide to perhaps diversify into some annual summer crops. And I've got an example of that we'll talk about later. So that's sensitivity, the degree to which the farm is affected by the climate-related events or exposures in that location. The third part of climate risk is adaptive capacity, and this is the ability of the farm to cope with these climate-related events. And it's in this adaptive capacity part of this climate risk equation that I think really there's a lot of promise for changing up management, trying new kinds of management, or figuring out that the management you're using is working well to increase the adaptive capacity of the farm. So again, this is 3 parts of climate risk: our exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Farmers, as an individual working on their own land, have very little ability to affect exposure other than being a good citizen and encouraging our leaders in national and international conversations to begin to mitigate or slow down global warming. There's really not a whole lot an individual can do about exposure. But sensitivity and adaptive capacity are well within the management realm of an individual farm. And so those are really 2 areas that we can think about changing management or just exploring management options for reducing climate risk.